Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a narrative that's honestly as cinematic as it is deeply, profoundly human. We're stepping into the source material to explore the incredibly complex and, let's face it, often misunderstood story of the very first mother, Eve. We're going to trace her journey here, not just as some distant symbol, but as a dynamic, living figure. Her descent into tragedy and her ascent into hope, it literally mirrors the human condition itself. Okay, let's dive right into this. The source text gives us this absolutely powerful framing. Eve enters Scripture like the answer to a silence. Think about that for a second. Before she even speaks a single word, her very existence carries this deep, profound theology. In the narrative, she isn't just fashioned from the dust the way Adam is. No, she's drawn from living humanity, from nearness, from genuine intimacy, from a shared substance. Which brings us to Chapter 1, the awakening of communion and the pinnacle of relational fullness. You see, if Adam reveals humanity's calling before God, Eve reveals our calling toward communion with each other. She is absolutely not just an accessory to the story. She is the exact moment creation reaches its relational fullness. When Adam first beholds her, language itself actually rises into poetry. He says, "Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh." For the very first time in the biblical narrative, wonder becomes deeply personal. Eve is the first human presence to awaken genuine astonishment in another human soul. So, how do we define her name in this context? Eve represents life arriving in reflected beauty. She embodies correspondence, mutuality, and shared glory. With her arrival, the overwhelming, echoing loneliness of that first world finally comes to an end. She isn't just slapped with the label of the first woman, she is communion personified. Now, what's really interesting about this is how it completely reframes Eve. She goes from being viewed as a simplistic victim to a courageous, thoughtful seeker. She's intellectually alert, emotionally present, capable of dialogue, and totally unafraid to engage. Where Adam often appears kind of receptive and silent in the garden, Eve moves toward interpretation. She listens, she processes, she evaluates, and she responds. She willingly steps right into the arena of meaning. But, as we'll see, that very strength actually becomes her vulnerability. And that leads us into Chapter 2, the tragedy of desire, sitting right at the crossroads of dignity and vulnerability. This right here marks the beginning of the fracture. Eve's willingness to engage, her very courage, is exactly where the deception targets her. Notice the tactic the serpent uses. It doesn't begin with brute force, it begins with distortion. A subtle, poisonous question just slides right into sacred space. Did God really say? And Eve does what so many of us do when we're confronted by a twisted truth, right? She enters the conversation. Let's walk through the anatomy of how this desire becomes misdirected. Notice the progression here. First, she sees the fruit as beautiful. Second, the promise sounds enlightening. It appeals to her innate longing for wisdom. And third, the moment feels incredibly urgent. Her fall isn't just about some base appetite. It's born out of a longing for understanding and elevation. And honestly, it reflects how human tragedy so often begins. Not with an open hatred of what's good, but with a misdirected desire for it, confusing the appearance of a thing with its reality. Then, the world breaks. In a rapid-fire sequence of irreversible choices, it begins. She takes. The boundary is crossed. She eats. A single, solitary act that fractures reality forever. And finally, she gives. In this unimaginably tragic moment, the fracture moves entirely through the covenant bond itself. The one who was introduced as the absolute fullness of shared life suddenly becomes the channel through which alienation spreads into the human story. This brings us to a heavy transition in Chapter 3, the mother of grief, navigating the world after innocence. Outside of Eden, the garden's abundance is just gone. The ground resists. We enter a reality of exile into a world of grueling labor and deep, deep fear. Yet it's exactly here that Scripture gives her one of its most extraordinary titles, the Mother of All Living. Think about the sheer emotional force of that title for a second. The first woman to experience the total collapse of paradise simultaneously becomes the first vessel of future hope. The one associated with the entrance of death is the very one through whom life continues. Let's trace our arc outside of Eden. After paradise is lost, she bears Cain. She's perhaps wondering in her heart if this child is the promised seed who's going to fix this broken world. But then, years later, comes the unthinkable. The first sons become the first brothers, divided by blood. Cain rises against Abel. There is a thunderous silence in Scripture here. Eve, who already knew the pain of spiritual rupture, now tastes the agonizing reality of maternal grief. She is the first mother to lose a child to death and another child to moral ruin. No human being before her had ever known such pain. Her tears literally become the hidden river flowing beneath all of human history. But the story does not end in the grave. We arrive at chapter 4, the echo of hope, and a whisper that the promise has not died. Because grace miraculously persists, the birth of Seth brings another line, another possibility. So the crucial point is that Eve becomes this indispensable theological mirror for all of us. She embodies the universal human longing for wisdom. She shows us the supreme danger of distorted desire. She bears the devastating pain of consequence. And yet she models the mysterious resilience of hope. She is a living, breathing battleground of trust. And this brilliantly illustrates the wider biblical narrative. The text prepares us for another woman standing at the threshold of history. On one side, we have Eve, who listens to distortion and opens the door to death. But on the other side, as the source points out, we have Mary. Mary who listens in faith and whose yes becomes the doorway through which life himself enters the world. Through that promised seed, the ancient wound of Eve begins to finally close. Eve refuses to be reduced to just a flattened symbol of failure. She is radiant in her origin, courageous in her thought, shattered by consequence, and yet transformed into the very mother of hope. So I want to leave you with this question to ponder today. When you look at her hunger to know, her ache of regret, and her stubborn, holy refusal to let hope die, how does Eve's intertwining of vulnerability, desire, and hope reflect your own human journey? Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.